142 steps from his cell to the center of the yard, and Marcus Cole counted every single one. Step 143 was where a blind man would stand across from a killer, weighing 286 pounds. Prison guard Derek Powell bet $3,000 this fight would last less than 60 seconds on the concrete. He did not know two things that would unravel everything he had built over 19 years inside Beaumont walls, forever. First, a 24-year-old inmate named Ricky had a phone recording every second from behind the crowd today. Second, the blind man Powell sent to die once killed 4 Taliban fighters barehanded inside a pitch-black cave near Tora Bora. In total darkness, Marcus Cole had been more dangerous than any sighted soldier the United States Special Forces had ever trained before. What happened in that prison yard did not just end a fight, it ended careers and destroyed an entire criminal empire inside. Before I take you deeper into this story, I need you to answer one question down in the comments section right now. Have you ever judged someone as weak, only to discover they were the most dangerous person in the room? And subscribe for more. 7 steps to the door, then 3 steps to the sink, and 5 steps to the bed, every single morning, without fail. That was the entire world of Marcus Cole, measured not in feet or meters, but in careful, deliberate steps he memorized. His cell in Beaumont, USP Federal Penitentiary, smelled of bleach and sweat, and the hum of ventilation that never really worked. The fluorescent light above meant nothing to him, because his eyes had not registered light since Afghanistan took that from him. Shrapnel from an IED outside Kandahar had severed both optic nerves and left his left shoulder covered in burn scars permanently. His eyes were pale gray and still like frosted glass that someone forgot to replace with something that actually functioned properly. He kept his head shaved because in prison, you eliminate anything an attacker could grab hold of during a confrontation easily. At 41 years old, Marcus Cole moved through Beaumont like smoke drifting along walls with his right hand always touching concrete. The other inmates watched him shuffle past and saw what Derek Powell saw, which was weakness wrapped in dark skin and silence. But weakness was just the mask Marcus had chosen to wear, and beneath it lived something that Beaumont was not ready for. Isaiah Thompson occupied the cell 2 doors down, and everyone in Block D called him Bible for obvious and ironic reasons. He was 58 years old, a former pastor who had stolen $2 million from his own congregation through a Ponzi scheme. His voice was deep, like a church organ, and he used it the same way he always had, to make people trust him. Every evening after Count Isaiah pressed his face to the gap beneath his cell door and read Marcus his letters aloud. The letters came from Marcus, his sister Denise in Houston, who wrote about Aisha and school and the neighborhood and everything normal. Marcus would sit on his bunk, pressing the paper to his chest as if he could absorb the words through his skin. One night, Isaiah described a drawing Aisha had included, showing a house with a yellow door and 2 stick figures holding hands. Marcus gripped that paper so hard, his knuckles went pale, and he could not breathe for almost 30 full seconds afterward. Isaiah heard the silence and understood it because he had lost his own family to his crimes and knew that specific silence. What Isaiah did not tell Marcus was that he was already planning something, and that plan would use Marcus as its centerpiece. Derek Powell walked the corridors of Beaumont like a man who owned every square inch of concrete steel and human flesh inside. 19 years as a corrections officer had taught him that real power was not in the rulebook, but in the shadows behind it. He ran a network of 4 guards who controlled the drug supply, the contraband phones, and the illegal fighting ring that operated. The fights happened in the yard during recreation hour, disguised as spontaneous conflicts that guards would be slow to break up conveniently. Powell used an encrypted app to take bets from other guards, from inmates with commissary money, and from people on the outside. His connection to the Aryan Brotherhood gave him enforcers, and his connection to the assistant warden gave him total protection from above. He was a former Marine, but the truth he buried deep was that he never saw combat, just pushed papers in Okinawa. Every real combat veteran in Beaumont reminded Powell of what he never was, and that poison had fermented into something cruel and specific. When Powell learned that the blind man in Block D was a decorated Delta Force operative, his reaction was not respect or caution. It was envy so toxic it tasted like battery acid on his tongue, and he decided right then to break Marcus Cole completely. It started small, the way all systematic destruction begins, with things that could be dismissed as coincidence or bad luck or bureaucracy. First, Marcus's cane disappeared from beside his bunk during a routine cell inspection, and nobody could explain where it had gone to. Without the cane, Marcus had to press both hands against walls, and his movement through the prison slowed to a painful, humiliating crawl. Guards watched him stumble, and some laughed, and Powell stood at the end of the corridor, taking notes on his phone about the reaction. 3 days later, the letters stopped arriving, and Marcus asked Isaiah to check with the mailroom about any possible delay. Isaiah came back with news that made Marcus go very still, because someone had flagged his correspondence for a security review indefinitely. Those letters were oxygen, and without them, Marcus sat in his cell, counting steps to nowhere, with nothing waiting at any destination. Powell was testing responses, measuring how much pressure the blind man could absorb before he cracked open and revealed something useful. Each move was calculated, and each response was catalogued, and Marcus felt the walls of his world shrinking smaller every single day. But Marcus had survived things that would have destroyed Derek Powell, and he held his silence like a weapon he refused to draw. Ricky Nunez was 24 years old, serving his first federal sentence for distribution, and he was terrified every single waking moment. Powell had assigned him as Marcus his helper, which meant carrying food trays, guiding him to the yard, and reporting everything back. At first, Ricky saw the assignment as protection, because being useful to Powell meant Powell, his boot, stayed off your neck temporarily. He would walk Marcus to the cafeteria, describing obstacles in a mumble, while mentally composing his reports for the guard afterward, every time. But something shifted during the 3rd week, when Marcus stopped at a corridor junction and said, "Ricky, your heart rate changes." Ricky froze because he hadn't said anything, and Marcus just listened to his pulse and knew he was afraid of something. Marcus told him, "Fear has a sound, and yours gets louder every time you come back from talking to Powell after our walks together." In that moment, Ricky understood that this blind man perceived more about the world than anyone with functioning eyes in Beaumont. He started editing his reports to Powell, leaving out details, softening observations, creating a version of Marcus that was less interesting. It was a small rebellion, barely visible. But in a place like Beaumont, small rebellions were the ones that got people killed most efficiently. The night visit came 6 weeks after Marcus arrived, and it was not Powell who appeared at his cell door in the darkness. The lock clicked open at 2:14 in the morning, and footsteps entered, heavy footsteps that made the concrete floor vibrate with each step. Marcus sat up on his bunk and pressed his back against the wall, and his hands came up instinctively to a guard position. The breathing was deep and controlled, like a large animal that had learned patience, and the smell was institutional soap and something metallic. Victor Salazar stood in the darkness of the cell, and for 10 seconds neither man said a single word to the other. Then Salazar spoke, and his voice was surprisingly quiet for a man who had killed 3 people with a hunting knife in Corpus Christi. He said, "The guard wants me to kill you in the yard next week during recreation, and I am telling you this right now." Marcus, his hands did not drop from their position, and his dead gray eyes pointed at nothing, but his ears tracked every micro sound. Salazar continued saying, "If I refuse, he sends someone else, and that someone will do it in a hallway without any cameras watching." The killer paused and then added something Marcus did not expect to hear from a man with 14 consecutive victories in the yard. Salazar said, "I am tired of this, and I have been tired for a long time. But Powell does not let anyone stop fighting." He explained that the fights were not just yard entertainment, but a streaming operation broadcast through encrypted channels to paying outside viewers. The assistant warden watched from his office and bet through a separate account, and the whole thing was a machine grinding inmates. Marcus listened and heard something in Salazar, his voice that he recognized from debriefings with soldiers who had been pushed past their operational limits. It was the sound of a man looking for permission to stop and not knowing how to ask for it without losing everything. Salazar told Marcus that Powell had set the fight for Thursday during afternoon recreation, and the yard would be arranged accordingly. He said, "Powell expects it to last less than a minute, and he expects you on the ground, broken or dead, when it ends." Marcus finally spoke, and his voice was so quiet, Salazar had to lean forward to hear the words coming from the blind man. Marcus said, "What if I told you there is a way we both walk out of that yard alive on Thursday afternoon next week?" Salazar was silent for a long time, and then the heavy footsteps retreated, and the cell door clicked shut behind 286 pounds of desperate hope. Isaiah waited until the yard cleared Thursday morning before he pressed his mouth against the ventilation gap and spoke words. He told Marcus something that changed the geometry of everything they thought they understood about Powell and his operation. The fights were not just entertainment for guards betting commissary money and bragging rights inside the walls of Beaumont Penitentiary. Isaiah had spent 4 months cultivating a source inside the administrative building who owed him protection from the Aryan Brotherhood. That source confirmed the encrypted streams reached devices in 3 states, and the subscriber list included 2 sitting judges. The money flowing through Powell, his network was not thousands, but hundreds of thousands routed through cryptocurrency wallets and shell accounts. Marcus sat on his bunk, and his fingers stopped moving across the braille letter he had been composing for Aisha. He understood now that Powell was not a bully with a badge, but a businessman protecting a revenue stream worth killing for. Isaiah let that silence breathe for exactly 5 seconds before delivering the part that mattered most to his plan. He said, "Someone needs to make Powell feel safe enough to put everything on camera Thursday, and that someone is you, Marcus." Marcus did not respond for almost 3 full minutes, and Isaiah counted every second through the wall separating their cells. The old pastor knew manipulation the way a surgeon knows anatomy, and he recognized that he was cutting into Marcus. His plan required Marcus to fight, and to fight spectacularly enough that the footage would be undeniable evidence in court. But asking a man who swore never to use his hands again was not a request. It was a detonation of everything. Isaiah had watched Marcus flinch when cell doors slammed shut and had heard him whispering Pashto in his sleep during nightmares. He knew the cost of what he was asking, and he asked it anyway because 19 inmates had been hospitalized since Powell. That number sat in Isaiah, his chest like a tumor. He could not pray away no matter how many scriptures he recited. He told himself this was righteous, and maybe it was but righteousness built on someone else. His pain has a specific taste. It tastes like the $2 million he stole from people who trusted him with their savings and their souls. Isaiah was a better man than he had been, but better was not the same thing as good, and he knew it. Ricky found Marcus in the cafeteria Wednesday afternoon, sitting alone with his tray untouched and his hands flat on the table. He sat down across from him and started talking about nothing, because that was their routine, and Powell expected reports. But halfway through describing the weather outside, Ricky stopped because Marcus, his hands were trembling against the metal surface barely. Ricky had never seen those hands shake before, not when Powell took his cane, not when the letters stopped. Marcus spoke without lifting his head and said, "Ricky, I need you to do something Thursday that will either save lives." Ricky, his stomach dropped because the way Marcus said it made clear the sentence had an unspoken ending attached to it. The ending was, or destroy yours, and Marcus was giving him the choice Powell never did when assigning him as spy. Marcus explained the phone and the angle and the timing with the precision of someone who had planned operations in hostile territory. Ricky listened and felt his pulse hammering in his throat so hard, he was certain Marcus could hear every single beat. He said yes, before his brain finished calculating the consequences, because some decisions live in your chest, not your head. Thursday morning, the humidity hit 94%, and the yard concrete radiated heat like a furnace door left open for hours. Inmates filed out for recreation, and the ones who knew arranged themselves in a loose circle that looked casual. Powell stood behind the chain-link partition with two of his guards flanking him and his encrypted phone recording the stream. His $3,000 bet was logged, and the odds were 14-1 against the blind man, surviving past 60 seconds. Salazar emerged from the east corridor, and the crowd parted for him, the way water parts for something that displaces everything. He was shirtless, and his body was a geography of violence with scars mapping every fight he had survived and won. His eyes found the blind man standing near the center of the yard with his arms at his sides and his face tilted. Ricky positioned himself behind two larger inmates and angled the phone through the gap between their shoulders with shaking hands. The stream counter on Powell, his phone showed 47 external viewers connected and paying $20 each for access. What none of those viewers understood was that they were not watching a fight, but recording their own complicity in it. Marcus heard Salazar before he felt him, because 286 pounds of muscle displaced Zaire in a way nothing else. The gravel crunched in a pattern that told Marcus everything about Salazar, his stance and weight distribution and dominant hand. Salazar came forward fast because the crowd expected violence, and hesitation would make Powell suspicious of their arrangement immediately. The first punch cut the air 6 inches from Marcus's jaw, and he shifted left with a movement so small nobody in that yard had ever seen a man move like water flowing around a stone without any apparent effort or urgency. Salazar swung again and again, and each time Marcus was simply not where the fist arrived a half-second later. The crowd noise died in stages, first confusion, then whispers, then a silence that spread like cold water across hot concrete. Powell, his smile disappeared, and he stepped closer to the chain link, gripping it with both hands, and his knuckles turning white. Marcus was listening to everything: the breathing, the gravel, the heartbeat, the tiny click of Salazar, his shoulder joint before. In the darkness behind his dead gray eyes, a map was building itself from pure sound, and that map was more accurate. Salazar understood first because he was the one throwing punches into empty space where a blind man should have been standing. His breathing was ragged after 90 seconds, and he had not landed a single strike on a target that never moved more. The crowd was frozen, and somewhere behind the bodies, Ricky, his phone captured every frame. With a steadiness his hands had stopped shaking, Marcus waited for the exact moment when Salazar, his weight shifted forward, past the point of no return on the gravel. Then he moved, and what happened next took less than 2 seconds, but would be analyzed frame by frame in federal court. His right hand redirected Salazar his momentum, while his left found the nerve cluster below the ear with surgical precision and pressure. Salazar went down, not like a man who had been beaten, but like a machine that someone had simply switched off completely. He landed on his side, and Marcus guided the fall, controlling 286 pounds of unconscious weight to prevent skull fracture. The technique had no name in any civilian martial arts manual because it was developed for operators working in zero-light conditions. Powell, his face behind the chain link, was the color of old paper, and his mouth was open, but nothing was coming out. The yard erupted into chaos that Powell, his guards, could not contain because the script had been destroyed in 2 seconds flat. Inmates who had been silent for years were screaming, and the sound bounced off concrete walls like something alive and hungry. Powell ordered the yard cleared and grabbed Salazar by the collar, dragging him toward the medical unit while shouting into his radio. Marcus stood exactly where he had been standing, and his breathing was even, and his hands were back at his sides. Ricky slipped the phone into his waistband and walked toward the east corridor with the crowd, and his legs felt made of water. Isaiah watched from the second-floor window and smiled the way a man smiles when a domino he placed months ago finally. Within 30 minutes, Marcus was in handcuffs, being escorted to the special housing unit for instigating a fight during recreation period. Powell wrote the incident report himself, and it described Marcus as the aggressor who attacked an unsuspecting inmate without any provocation. The report made no mention of organized betting or encrypted streams or 47 paying viewers who watched a blind man. But the thing about digital evidence is that deleting your copy does not delete the 47 copies already downloaded worldwide. Isaiah moved that night with a speed that contradicted his 58 years and his reputation as a slow-moving religious fraud. He sent word through 3 intermediaries to his attorney, who owed him for testimony Isaiah provided in another federal case. The attorney contacted Jennifer Austin at the Federal Public Defender Office in Houston, using language carefully chosen to trigger obligation. Jennifer was handling an unrelated appeal at Beaumont and had security clearance that gave her access to inmate communications legally. By Friday morning, the video file had traveled from Ricky his phone to a prepaid device to an encrypted email. Jennifer watched it 7 times, and each time her face lost more color because she understood what she was actually seeing. This was not just assault or corruption, but a RICO case involving federal employees streaming violence for profit across state lines. She filed an emergency motion with the district court requesting immediate protective custody for Marcus Cole and preservation of evidence. The judge denied it, citing insufficient foundation, and Jennifer learned something that Beaumont inmates already knew about justice and timing. The system was not broken because broken things can be fixed, but this system was working exactly as certain people designed it. Powell had 72 hours to destroy Marcus Cole before the outside world discovered what lived inside Beaumont walls. He started with isolation, because a blind man alone in the special housing unit becomes nothing more than meat. The SHU cell measured 6 feet by 9 feet, with no window and a steel door that sealed like a coffin lid. Marcus counted the new dimensions in 4 steps and 2 steps, and realized his entire world had been cut in half overnight. The fluorescent tube above buzzed at a frequency that mimicked the drone aircraft he remembered from Kandahar province airfields years ago. Every 40 minutes, a guard slammed the food slot open and shut without delivering food, just to trigger the flinch response. Powell had read enough about PTSD to weaponize sound against a man whose darkness was already filled with ghosts from Afghanistan. The first 12 hours, Marcus held steady, pressing his palms flat against cold concrete and breathing in 4-second intervals. By hour 18, the slamming had merged with the IED explosion, and Marcus was whispering Pashto coordinates to men already dead. But what Powell did not understand about breaking a Delta Force operator was that breaking and destroying are different things entirely. Jennifer Austin sat in her Houston office, staring at a court denial that should have made her quit the case. The judge wanted more foundation, which in federal legal language meant bring me something I cannot ignore or stop wasting time. She had watched the yard video 11 times now, and each viewing revealed details that made her stomach tighten another notch. Frame 347 showed Powell his face, clearly visible behind the chain link, his phone raised and angled toward the fight. Frame 512 captured the encrypted streaming interface, reflected in the phone screen of the guard standing beside Powell on duty. Frame 620 showed Marcus his precise control technique that no untrained person could execute under pressure against a larger opponent. Jennifer knew this was enough for any honest judge, but the word honest carried asterisks in Jefferson County courthouse hallways. She called her supervisor, who told her to focus on her assigned caseload and stop chasing conspiracy theories about prison fights. Jennifer hung up the phone and did something that would either make her career or end it within the next week. She called a reporter at the Houston Chronicle named David Herrera, who had been investigating Beaumont for 3 long years. Inside the SHU, Marcus lost track of time because darkness without sound markers becomes an ocean without any visible shoreline. Powell visited personally on what Marcus calculated was the second night based on meal patterns and guard shift changes. The door opened and Powell, his boots made a distinctive sound because he dragged his left heel slightly from an old injury. Marcus was sitting on the concrete floor with his back against the wall and his hands resting open on his knees. Powell said, You made me look stupid in front of 47 people who pay me good money for entertainment every week. Marcus said nothing because silence was the only weapon he had left in a 6 by 9 foot concrete box. Powell stepped closer, and Marcus heard the guard his weight shift forward onto his toes, which meant a kick was coming. The boot caught Marcus in the ribs, and the sound was wet and dense, like a bag of sand dropped from a table. Marcus absorbed the impact by rolling with it exactly the way his body had been trained to do for 15 years. What neither man knew was that camera number 7 in the SHU corridor was recording everything through a wire mesh window. That camera was supposed to be decommissioned in 2019, but budget cuts left it connected to a server nobody monitored anymore. The server sat in a maintenance closet behind the administrative building, running on backup power and collecting footage automatically every day. Isaiah knew about this camera because his source in administration had mentioned it during one of their protection arrangement conversations. It was insurance that Isaiah filed away in his memory, the way he once filed away sermon illustrations for maximum impact. Now that insurance was appreciating in value every single time Powell walked into the SHU to visit Marcus Cole alone. Isaiah could not access the footage himself, but he knew someone who could, and that person did not know it yet. Ricky Nunez was recovering in the prison infirmary with a jaw wired shut and an official report listing his injuries. The report said Ricky fell down a staircase in Block C, which was remarkable because Block C had no staircases at all. Powell had beaten Ricky 16 hours after the yard fight because someone told him the young inmate had been holding. But Powell made the same mistake with Ricky that he made with Marcus, which was assuming that pain creates obedience. Pain created something else entirely in Ricky Nunez, and that something had a taste like copper and a color like red. Through his wired jaw, Ricky whispered to the infirmary orderly, who whispered to an inmate, who whispered to Isaiah Thompson. The message was 4 words long, and each word carried the weight of a 24-year-old man choosing war. Isaiah received those 4 words and closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, said a prayer he actually meant. The words were, "I still have copies," and they meant that Ricky had uploaded the video before Powell confiscated the phone. 3 copies existed on 3 different cloud servers, accessed through 3 different accounts that Powell could never reach from inside. Isaiah passed this information through his attorney chain to Jennifer Austin, who received it at 11:47 Tuesday night. Jennifer pulled the files, and now she had not just the yard footage, but Ricky, his medical records, showing injuries inconsistent. She also had timestamps proving Powell was on duty in Block C during the exact hours Ricky sustained his impossible staircase. The dominoes Isaiah placed months ago were falling, but dominoes fall in one direction, and you cannot control where they stop. David Herrera from the Houston Chronicle had spent 3 years collecting stories from former Beaumont inmates about systematic abuse. He had affidavits and medical records and transfer documents, but never enough to convince his editor to publish against federal. When Jennifer Austin called him, she did not share the video because that would violate attorney-client privilege and federal rules. Instead, she told him exactly which Freedom of Information requests to file and which server maintenance logs to subpoena. Herrera was not naive enough to think this was coincidence, but he was hungry enough to follow the breadcrumbs wherever. Within 48 hours, he had filed 7 FOIA requests, targeting Beaumont's security camera, maintenance records, and server access logs specifically. The Bureau of Prisons responded with the standard 60-day delay, which meant someone in Washington noticed the specificity of his. Jennifer, meanwhile, filed a second emergency motion, this time not with the local judge, but with the Fifth Circuit Court directly. She argued that Marcus Cole faced imminent danger of serious physical harm based on documented patterns of retaliation against cooperating inmates. The Fifth Circuit responded in 14 hours, which in federal appellate terms was the equivalent of a 5-alarm fire response. Powell felt the ground shift beneath him on Wednesday morning when the warden called him into the office for a meeting. The warden was not angry but nervous, and nervous wardens are more dangerous than angry ones because fear makes people. He told Powell that the Fifth Circuit had ordered an independent medical examination of Marcus Cole within 24 hours. He told Powell that a Houston Chronicle reporter had filed FOIA requests targeting specific camera systems that only internal staff would know. He told Powell to make sure everything in the SHU was clean and documented and consistent with federal standards by tomorrow. Powell walked out of that office, and his left heel dragged more than usual because his body knew before his mind. He went to the SHU and stood outside Marcus's cell and listened to the blind man breathing steadily inside the box. For 19 years, Powell had been the one who decided who suffered and who survived inside these walls every day. Now he was calculating his own odds the way inmates calculated theirs, and the math was turning against him very fast. The thing about power built on silence is that it only takes one voice to bring the entire architecture crashing down. Marcus heard Powell standing outside his cell for 11 minutes before the guard finally walked away without opening the door. In those 11 minutes, Marcus mapped every shift in Powell, his breathing from controlled authority to something ragged and hunted. He recognized that sound because he had heard it in the breathing of men who knew an airstrike was coming for them. Marcus pressed his palms against the concrete and felt the vibration of the building and somewhere deep in the structure doors. He thought about Aisha and the yellow door in her drawing, and the two stick figures holding hands on the paper. He thought about Isaiah, who had used him as a weapon without asking permission, the way commanders used operators in missions. He thought about Ricky, whose jaw was wired shut because he chose to hold a phone instead of looking away. And he thought about Salazar, who came to his cell not to threaten, but to ask permission to stop being a monster. Marcus Cole sat in the darkness of the SHU and understood that his promise to never fight again had been wrong. The promise should never have been to stop fighting, but to finally choose what was worth the cost of raising his hands.